One could say what? Siding just felt peculiar, light, with the taint thick on the male half of the source. What else would it feel? Rand hoped they were not all coming down with his new sickness. Nalam's gateway opened and vanished behind him in his blister.
1 second.
Rand let himself really feel Siding. Life and corruption commingled. Ice to make winter's heart seem warm. Fire to make a forge's flames cold. Death waiting for him to slip. Wanting him to slip. It did not feel any different, did it? He scowled at where Nalam had disappeared. Nalam and the woman. She was the fourth Suldam taken this afternoon. That made 23 Suldam prisoners with the carts. And 2 Damani, each still in her silvery leash and collar, carried on separate carts. In those collars, they could not walk 3 steps before becoming more violently sick than Rand did, seizing the source. He was not sure the sisters with Matt would be pleased to receive them after all. The first Damani, 3 days before, he had not thought of as a prisoner. A slender woman with pale yellow hair and big blue eyes, she was a Shonchan captive to be freed, he thought. But when he forced a Suldam to remove the woman's collar, her Adam, she screamed for the Suldam to help her, and immediately began lashing out with the power. She had even offered her neck for the Suldam to replace the thing. 9 defenders and a soldier died before she could be shielded. Gedwin would have killed her on the spot had Rand not stopped it. The defenders, nearly as uncomfortable around women who could channel as others were around men who could, the defenders still wanted her dead. They had taken casualties in the fighting these past days, but having men killed by a prisoner seemed to offend them. There had been more casualties than Rand had expected. 31 defenders dead and 46 companions. More than 200 among the Legion men and the nobles' armsmen. 7 soldiers and a dedicated. Men Rand had never met before they answered his summons to Ilion. Too many, considering that all except the gravest injury could be healed, if a man could only hang on until there was time. But he was driving the Shonchan west, driving them hard. More shouting rose somewhere far off down in the valley. Fire blossomed a good 3 miles to the west, and lightning struck, toppling trees. Trees and stone erupted from a mountainside farther on, strange fountains marching along the slope. The roaring booms swallowed shadows. The Shonchan were retreating. "Get down there," Rand told Flynn and Deshiva. "Both of you. Find Gedwin and tell him I said push! Push!" Deshiva grimaced at the forest below, then began awkwardly tugging his horse along the ridge. The man was ungainly with horses, riding or leading. He nearly tripped over his sword. Flynn looked up at Rand worriedly. "You mean to stay here alone, my Lord Dragon?" "I'm hardly alone," Rand said dryly, glancing at Ailil and Anayla. They had ridden back to their armsmen, almost 200 lancers waiting just short of where the ridge began to slope down to the east. At their head, Den Harid frowned through the face bars of his helmet. He had command of both lots now, and if his concern was for Ailil and Anayla, his fellows still made a show fit to keep away most attackers. Besides, Wyraman had the northern end of this ridge secured, so a fly could not pass, he claimed, and Bashir held the south. Without boasting, Bashir just erected a wall of lances without talking about it. And the Shonchan were retreating. "And I'm hardly helpless anyway, Flynn." Flynn actually looked doubtful and scratched his fringe of white hair before saluting and leading his horse toward where Deshiva's gateway was already winking out. Limping along, Flynn shook his head, muttering to himself, fit for Deshiva. Rand wanted to snarl. He could not go mad, and neither could they. Flynn's gateway vanished, and Rand returned to his study of the treetops. It was quiet again. Time stretched in stillness. This notion of taking the outposts in the mountains had been a bad one. He was willing to admit that now. In this terrain, you could be half a mile from any army without knowing it. In those tangled woods down there, you could be 10 feet from them without knowing. He needed to face the Shonchan on better ground. He needed... Abruptly, he was fighting Saladin, fighting wild urges that tried to ream out his skull. The void was vanishing, melting beneath the onslaught. Frantic, dazed, he released the source before it could kill him. Nausea twisted his middle. Double vision showed him 2 crowns of swords. Lying on the thick mulch of dead leaves in front of his face, he was on the ground. He did not seem to breathe properly and struggled to suck in air. There was a chip broken off one of the crown's golden laurel leaves, and blood stained several of the golden sword points. A knot of hot pain in his side told him those never-healing wounds had broken open. He tried to push himself up and cried out. In stunned amazement, he stared at the dark fletchings of an arrow stuck through his right arm. With a groan, he collapsed. Something ran down his face. Something dripped in front of his eye. Blood. Vaguely, he became aware of ululating cries. Horsemen appeared among the trees to the north, galloping along the ridge, some with lowered lances, some working short bows as fast as they could knock and draw. Horsemen in blue and yellow armor of overlapping plates and helmets like huge insects' heads. Shonchan. Several hundred of them, it seemed. From the north. So much for Wyverman's fly. Rand struggled to reach the source. Too late to worry about sicking up or falling on his face. Another time he might have laughed at that. He struggled. It was like fumbling for a pin in the dark with numbed fingers. Time to die, Lews Therin whispered. Rand had always known Lews Therin would be there at the end. Not 50 paces from Rand, screaming Tyrans and Karianan plowed into the Shonchan. "Fight, you dogs!" Anila shrieked, swinging down from her saddle beside him. "Fight!" The willow lady in her silks and laces hurled a string of curses that would have made a wagon driver's tongue go dry. Anila stood holding her mount's reins, glaring from the mill of men and steel to Rand. It was Eilil who turned him onto his back. Kneeling there, she looked down at him with an unreadable expression in her big dark eyes. He could not seem to move. He felt drained. He was not sure he could blink. Screams and the clash of steel rang in his ears. "If he dies in our hands, Bashir will hang both of us." Anila certainly was not simpering now. "If those black-coated monsters get hold of us?" She shuddered and bent closer to Eilil, gesturing with a belt knife he had not noticed in her hand before. A ruby sparkled blood red on the hilt. "Your lance captain could break off enough men to get us away. We could be miles away before he's found, and back to our estates by the time." "I think he can hear us," Eilil broke in calmly. Her red-gloved hands moved at her waist, sheathing a belt knife or drawing one. "If he dies here," she cut off as sharply as the other woman had, and her head jerked around. Hooves thundered past Rand on either side in thick streams, galloping north toward the Shonchan. Sword in hand, Bashir barely reined in before leaping from his saddle. Gregor and Panar dismounted more slowly, but he waved his sword at the men flooding by. "Strike home for King and Ilion!" he shouted. "Strike home! The Lord of the Morning! The Lord of the Morning!" The crash of steel rose higher, and the screaming. "It would be like this, the last of it," Bashir growled, favoring the 2 women with suspicious glares. He wasted only an instant, though, before raising his voice above the din of the battle. "More! Burn your Ashaman hide! Here! Now!" He did not shout that the Lord Dragon was down, thank the light. With an effort, Rand turned his head perhaps a hand. Enough to see Ilianers and Saldeans driving on north. The Shonchan must have given way. "More!" The name roared through Bashir's mustaches, and Moore himself dropped from a galloping horse nearly on top of Anila. She looked disgruntled at the lack of an apology as the man knelt beside Rand, scrubbing dark hair out of his face. She moved back quickly enough when she realized he intended to channel, though, practically bounding away. Eilil was much smoother about rising, but not noticeably slower in stepping clear. And she slipped a silver-handled belt knife back into its sheath at her waist. Healing was a simple matter, if not exactly comfortable. The fletchings were broken off, and the arrow drawn the rest of the way through with a sharp jerk that brought a gasp to Rand's lips. But that was just to clear the way. Dirt, lightly embedded fragments, would fall away as flesh knit itself up, but only Flynn and a few others could use the power to remove what was driven deep. Resting two fingers on Rand's chest, Moore caught his tongue between his teeth with a fixed expression and wove healing. That was how he always did it. It did not work for him otherwise. It was not the complex weaves that Flynn used. Few could manage that, and none as well as Flynn so far. This was simpler, rougher. Waves of heat rushed through Rand, strong enough to make him grunt and send sweat gushing from every pore. He quivered violently from head to foot. A roast in the oven must have felt that way. The sudden flood of heat ebbed slowly, and Rand lay panting. In his head, Lews Therin panted too. "Kill him! Kill him!" over and over. Muting the voice to a faint buzz, Rand thanked Moore. The young man blinked as if surprised, then grabbed the dragon scepter from the ground and forced himself to his feet. Erect, he swayed slightly. Bashir started to offer an arm, then backed away at a gesture. Rand could stand unaided. Barely. He could as soon have flown by waving his arms as channeled, though. When he touched his side, his shirt slipped on blood, yet the old round scar and the newer slash across it merely felt tender. Half-healed only, but they had never been better than that since he got them. For a moment, he studied the two women. Aniela murmured something vaguely congratulatory and offered him a smile that made him wonder whether she intended to lick his wrist. Ailil stood very straight, very cool, as if nothing had happened. Had they meant to leave him to die, or to kill him? But if so, why send their armsmen charging in and rush to check on him? On the other hand, Ailil had drawn her knife once the talk of him dying began. Most of the Saldaeans and Ilianers were galloping north or riding down the slope of the ridge, pursuing the last of the Seanchan. And then Wyraman appeared from the north, riding a tall, glossy black at a slow canter that picked up when he saw Rand. His armsmen rode in double file at his back. "My lord, dragon," the High Lord intoned as he dismounted. He still seemed as clean as he had in Ilion. Bashir simply looked rumpled and a bit grimy here and there, but Gregorin's finery was decidedly dirt-stained and slashed down one sleeve besides. Wyraman flourished a bow to shame a king's court. "Forgive me, my lord dragon. I thought I saw Seanchan advancing in front of the ridge and went to meet them. I never suspected this other company. You can't know how it would pain me if you were injured." "I think I know," Rand said dryly, and Wyraman blinked. Seanchan advancing? Perhaps. Wyraman would always snatch at a chance for glory in the charge. "What did you mean at the last, Bashir?" "They're pulling back," Bashir replied. In the valley, fire and lightning erupted for a moment, as if to give him the lie, but nearly to the far end. "Your scouts do say they all do be retreating," Gregorin said, rubbing his beard, and gave Moore a sidelong, uncomfortable glance. Moore grinned at him toothily. Rand had seen the Ilianer in the thick of fighting, heading his men, shouting encouragement and laying his sword about with wild abandon. But he flinched at Moore's grin. Gedwin strode up then, leading his horse carelessly, insolently. He almost sneered at Bashir and Gregorin, frowned at Wyraman as if already knowing the man's blunder, and eyed Ailil and Aniela as though he might pinch them. The two women drew back from him hastily, but then so did the men, except for Bashir. Even more. Gedwin's salute to Rand was a casual tap of fist to chest. "I sent scouts out as soon as I saw this lot was done. There are 3 more columns inside 10 miles. "All headed west," Bashir put in quietly, but he looked at Gedwin sharp enough to slice stone. "You've done it," he told Rand. "They're all falling back. I doubt they'll stop short of Abu Dar. Campaigns don't always end with a grand march into the city, and this one is finished." Surprisingly, or perhaps not, Wyraman began arguing for an advance to "take Abu Dar for the glory of the Lord of the Morning," as he put it. But it was certainly a shock to hear Gedwin say he would not mind taking a few more swipes at these Seanchan, and he certainly would not mind seeing Abu Dar. Even Ailil and Aniela added their voices in favor of putting an end to the Seanchan once and for all, though Ailil did add that she would as soon like to avoid having to return to finish. She was quite sure the Lord Dragon would insist on her company for it. That in a tone as cool and dry as night in the Aiel waste. Only Bashir and Gregorin spoke for turning back, and raised their voices they did increasingly as Rand stood silent and staring west, toward Abu Dar. "We did do what we came for," Gregorin insisted. "Light's mercy. Do you think to take Abu Dar itself?" Take Abu Dar, Rand thought. Why not? No one expected that. A total surprise for the Shonchan and everybody else. "Times are you seize the advantage and ride on," Bashir growled. "Other times you take your winnings and go home. I say it's time to go home." "I would not mind you in my head," Luce Theron said, sounding almost sane. "If you are not so clearly mad." Abu Dar. Rand tightened his hand on the dragon scepter, and Luce Theron cackled. Chapter 24. A Time for Iron. A dozen leagues east of Abu Dar, Rakan glided in out of the cloud-streaked sunrise to land in a long pasture marked as the Flyers' Field by colored streamers on tall poles. The brown grasses had been trampled and scored days since. All of the creature's grace in the air was lost as soon as their claws touched the ground in a lumbering run, leathery pinions 30 paces or more wide held high as if the animal wanted to sweep itself back upward. There was little beauty, either, in the Rakan that ran awkwardly down the field, beating ribbed wings, Flyers crouching in the saddle as if to pull the beast up by main force, ran on until at last they stumbled into the air, wingtips barely clearing the tops of the olive trees at the end of the field. Only as they gained height and turned toward the sun, soared toward the clouds, did the Rakan regain dignified grandeur. Flyers who landed did not bother to dismount. While a groundling held a basket up for the Rakan to gulp whole shriveled fruits by the double handful at a time, one of the Flyers would hand down their scouting report to a still more senior groundling, and the other bent on the other side to receive new orders from a Flyer too senior to handle reins personally very often. Almost that quickly after coming to a halt, the creature was reined around to waddle over to where 4 or 5 others waited their turn to make that long, ungainly run to the sky. At a dead run, dodging between formations of cavalry and infantry, messengers carried the scouting reports to the huge red-bannered command tent. There were haughty Tarabonner lancers and stolid Amadisian pikemen in well-ordered squares, breastplates striped horizontally in the colors of the regiments they were attached to. Altaran light horse, in disordered bunches, made their mounts prance, vain of the red slashes crisscrossing their chests, so different from the markings anyone else wore. The Altarans did not know those indicated irregulars of doubtful reliability. Among the Shonchan soldiers, named regiments with proud honors were represented in the Empire. Pale-eyed men from Alkam, honey-brown men from Encon, men black as coal from Koial and Dalanshar. There were Marat Torm, on their sinuous, bronze-scaled mounts that made horses wicker and dance in fright, and even a few Marat Grolm, with their squat, beak-mouthed charges. But one thing that always accompanied a Shonchan army was conspicuous by its absence. The Suldam and Damani were still in their tents. Captain General Kanameraj thought of the Suldam and Damani a great deal. From his seat on the dais, he could see the map table clearly, where helmetless under-lieutenants checked the reports and placed markers to represent the forces in the field. A small paper banner stood above each marker, inked symbols giving the size and composition of the force. Finding decent maps in these lands was next to impossible, but the map copied atop the large table was sufficient, and worrying in what it told him. Black discs for outposts overrun or dispersed. Far too many of them, dotting the whole eastern half of the Venya Range. Red wedges, for commands on the move, marked the western end as thickly, all pointed back toward Abu Dar. And scattered among the black discs, 17 stark white. As he watched, a young officer in the brown and black of a Marat Torm carefully placed an 18th. Enemy forces. A few might be the same group seen twice, but for the most part, they were much too far apart. The timing of the sightings wrong. Along the walls of the tent, clerks in plain brown coats, marked only with insignia of rank among clerks on the wide collars, waited at their writing tables, pens in hand, for Mirage to issue orders that they would copy out for distribution. He had already given what orders he could. There were as many as 90,000 enemy soldiers in the mountains, nearly twice what he could muster here, even with the native levies. Too many for belief, except that scouts did not lie. Liars had their throats slit by their fellows. Too many, springing out of the ground like trapworms in the Centejor. At least they had 100 miles of mountain yet to cover if they intended to threaten Nebudar. Almost 200, the white discs furthest east, and hill country after that for another 100 miles. Surely the enemy general could not mean to let his dispersed forces be confronted one by one. Gathering them together would take more time. Time alone was on his side right then. The entry flaps of the tent swept open, and the High Lady Suroth glided in, black hair a proud crest spilling down her back, pleated snow-white gown and richly embroidered overrobe somehow untouched by the mud outside. He had thought her still in Nebudar. She must have flown out by Torakin. She was accompanied by a small entourage, for her. A pair of Death Watch guards with black tassels on their sword hilts held the tent flaps, and more were visible outside. Stone-faced men in red and green. The embodiment of the Empress. Might she live forever? Even the blood took note of them. Suroth sailed past as if they were as much servants as the lushly bodied Dakavale, in slippers and a nearly transparent white robe, her honey yellow hair in a multitude of thin braids, who carried the High Lady's gilded writing desk a meek 2 paces behind. Suroth's voice of the blood Alwyn, a glowering woman in green robes, with the left side of her head shaved and the remainder of her pale brown hair in a severe braid, followed close on her mistress's heels. As Mirage stepped down from the dais, he realized with shock that the second Dakavale behind Suroth, short and dark-haired and slim in her diaphanous robe, was Damani. A Damani garbed as property was unheard of, but odder still, it was Alwyn who led her by the Edam. He let none of his amazement show as he went to one knee, murmuring, "The light be upon the High Lady Suroth. All honor to the High Lady Suroth." Everyone else prostrated themselves on the canvas groundcloth, eyes down. Mirage was of the blood, yet too low to shave the sides of his scalp like Suroth. Only the nails of his little fingers were lacquered, much too low to register surprise if a High Lady allowed her voice to continue acting as Suldam after being raised to the Sojin. Strange times in a strange land, where the Dragon Reborn walked, and Marath Damani ran wild to kill and enslave where they would. Suroth barely glanced at him before turning to study the map table, and if her black eyes tightened at what she saw, she had cause. Under her, the Hylian had done far more than had been dreamed, reclaiming great stretches of the stolen lands. All they had been sent for was to scout the way, and after Falma, some had thought even that impossible. She drummed fingers on the table irritably, the long blue-lacquered fingernails on the first 2 clicking. Continued success, and she might be able to shave her head entirely and paint a 3rd nail on each hand. Adoption into the imperial family was not unheard of for achievements so great. And if she stepped too far, overstepped, she might find her fingernails clipped and herself stuffed into a filmy robe to serve one of the blood, if not sold to a farmer to help till his fields, or sweat in a warehouse. At worst, Mirage would only have to open his own veins. He continued to watch Suroth in patient silence, but he had been a scout lieutenant, or a Bracken, before being raised to the blood, and he could not help being aware of everything around him. A scout lived or died by what he saw or did not, and so did others. The men lying on their faces around the tent, some hardly seemed to breathe. Suroth should have taken him aside and let them continue with their work. The messenger was being turned at the entrance. That was the message that the woman tried to push past Death Watch guards. The Dakavale with the writing desk in her arms caught his eye. Scowls flashed across her pretty doll's face. She looked down for more than moments. Property showing anger. Now there was something else. His gaze flickered to the Damani, who stood with her head down, but still looked around with curiosity. Brown-eyed Dakavale and pale-eyed Damani looked about as different as two women could, yet there was something about them, something in their faces. Strange. He could not have said how old either was. Quick as his glance was, Alwyn noticed. With a twitch of the Adam's silvery leash, she put the Damani face down on the ground cloth. Snapping her fingers, she pointed to the canvas with a hand not encumbered by the Adam's bracelet, then grimaced when the honey-haired Dakavale did not move. "Down, Leandrin," she hissed almost under her breath. With a glare for Alwyn, a glare, the Dakavale sank to her knees, features painted with sulkiness. Most strange, but hardly important. Face impassive and otherwise bursting with impatience, he waited. Impatience and discomfort. He had been raised to the blood after riding 50 miles in a single night with 3 arrows in him to bring word of a rebel army marching on Shandar itself, and his back still pained him. Finally, Sirath turned from the map table. She did not give him leave to rise, much less embrace him as one of the blood. Not that he had expected that. He was far beneath her. "You are ready to march?" she demanded curtly. At least she did not speak to him through her voice. Before so many of his officers, the shame would have put his eyes on the ground for months, if not years. "I will, Sarath," he replied calmly, meeting her gaze. He was of the blood, however low. "They cannot combine in fewer than 10 days, with at least another 10 before they can exit the mountains. Well before then, They could be here tomorrow," she snapped. "Today. If they come, Mirage, they will come by the ancient art of traveling, and it seems very possible that they will come."
Hey, just chill. How you doing, bro?
On their bellies before they could restrain themselves.
Alright, let's do a dab then.
Her emotions, babbled of legends.
I've been dabbing.
You're certain. The words popped out of his mouth before he could stop.
I had some
He had
new
only
pins.
thought she had lost control before. Her eyes blazed. She gripped the edges of her flower-worked robe, white-knuckled, and her hands shook. "Do you question me?" she snarled incredulously. "Suffice it that I have my sources of information." And was furious with them as much as with him.
I haven't been doing too bad. How about yourself? Just chilling.
There will be
Let me get my dab ready.
as many as 50 of these grandly named.
How was your holidays?
But no more than 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers. It seems there have been no more since the beginning, whatever the
life's life.
Say.
What can I say?
Mirage nodded slowly.
New Year's?
5,000 men moved about.
I guess I'm ready.
One power would explain a great deal.
It's just another day to me.
She knew numbers so precisely.
Except for one, I got to deal with having to listen to fireworks.
She certainly had listeners and
that stuff still
watching her too.
Gets
the
to
very
me.
idea of a man channeling made him want
ever since that's fireworks is what I blew my thumb off with.
Gathered from every nation by the Dragon Reborn, this Bandalthor.
You ready for New Year? Just chilling.
There could be so many. The Dragon Reborn could channel, he said. That might be true, but he was the Dragon Reborn. The prophecies of the Dragon.
Oh yeah.
I
don't know how that is.
Much different from the pure version with their band.
Well, me and my brother, we got some socks and shirts and whatnot from our mom.
Not one mentioned him serving the crystal fruit.
Then our buddy, our friend, Ouija Bud, she got us a couple cool things.
These lands could be reclaimed before.
She got me a light table so I could do my diamond painting kits on, or my diamond painting on. So that was pretty cool. But we weren't able to get anyone anything just because, yeah, we didn't have the cash.
awe they felt, kneeling before the crystal throne, with the thirst to obey drying their tongues. But it seemed obvious that bundling the fellow onto the ship would be easier, and disposing of the Ashaman. Fell on his way across the Arath Ocean, which brought him back to trying to avoid, realized with an inward start.
That was a good one there.
He was not a man to shy from difficulties, much less blindly. But this was different from any he had faced before. He had fought battles with the money used on both sides. He knew the way of them. It was not only a matter of with the power. Experienced Suldam would somehow see what Damani or Marath Damani did, and Damani would tell the others so they could defend as well. Would Suldam see what a man did too? You will Suldam and Damani to me, he said. Taking a deep breath in spite of himself, he added, if they're still sick, it will be a short fight and bloody on our side. Another stir among the men waiting on their faces. Every second rumor in the camp was about what illness had confined the money to their tents. Alwyn reacted quite openly, most improper in a Sojin, with a furious glare. The Damani flinched again and began to shiver where she lay. Oddly, the honey-haired Dakavali flinched as well.
That's definitely a good one there.
Glided to where the Dakavali knelt. Why would she smile at a poorly trained serving girl? She began stroking the kneeling woman's.
Then I got my dentist appointment on Tuesday for my abscess tooth that they're gonna pull.
Siroth's first words supported that.
Definitely,
for him.
Not looking forward to that.
Small failures bring small costs. Great failures bring painfully great costs. You will have the money you require, Mirage, and you will teach these Ashaman they should have remained in the north. You will wipe them from the face of the earth. The Ashaman, the soldiers, all of them. To the man,
start this part over again.
I have spoken. It will be as you say, Siroth, he replied. They will be destroyed. To the man. There was nothing else he could say now. He wished, though, that she had given him an answer about whether the Suldam...
Yeah, I was taking antibiotics for it, but it still don't...
Taidashar around near the crest of the bare stony hill to watch most of
it still doesn't solve the problem.
He held on
because antibiotics it
seemed to tremble in his grasp.
It takes the swelling and the infection down, but they still gotta remove the tooth. Because if they don't,
chill both colder and beneath notice.
The
never healing wounds in his side were a dull and distant.
It'll be all right for a while, then it'll act up again. It doesn't go away until you actually
maybe after
remove the tooth, which causes the problem.
You don't want so much to die anymore.
And the truth is, it's two of them back here that they're going to have to remove. The only constant
in the man was the desire to kill, which just happened to include killing himself often enough.
Yeah, but I was taking, they had me on two different antibiotics for two different things they're trying to,
it had only been 6 days. The disgust did not
trying to fight.
He would not let it.
Because it was a pretty bad, then to say it was a pretty bad infection.
Yes.
It was a deep infection.
Iron hearts and iron stomachs too. He bent a moment to touch the long cloth-wrapped package under his stirrup leather.
Oh yeah, I was gonna try this pin.
Not time yet. Maybe not at all.
But it's actually
uncertainty shimmered
diamonds.
Across the boy, and maybe something else. Not at all, he hoped. Uncertainty, yes, but the other half had not been fear. It had not. Half the surrounding low hills were covered with squat, gnarled olive trees, dappled by the sunlight, where lancers already rode along the rows to make sure they were clear.
Tasty.
There was
what's
no
cool about these is, you know how sometimes you get your pins that
the hills were darker,
get clogged after a while. These were
Legion
actually
men, emerging in trotting
guaranteed
files below Ray, formed up, trailed by
to not clog.
now enlisted into the
They
Legion.
did up.
As soon as their ranks were aligned, they
If it ever clogged, you gotta just touch the bottom 3 times.
The ground seemed mostly clay, and boots and hooves alike skidded in the thin skim of mud.
And it turned blue like that.
No wonder, though, only a few clouds
and
in
then
the sky, white and clean. The sun was a pale yellow ball.
When it's blue like that, you're gonna want to hit it, and that's what helps keep it not,
and Flynn were among the men
or keeps it from getting clogged,
as were Adley and Hopwell.
or unclogged.
Some of the gateways lay out of Rand's side.
Cause that
he wanted everyone through as
it
quickly as
heats
possible,
it up a little bit. It
except for
allows you to
scanning the
take
sky.
a draw out of
Every man
it
in a black coat
and unclog it.
already out scouting held a weave. Even Gedwin and Rothschild, though both grimaced over it, at each other and in his direction.
But this one's
Rand felt
definitely
no longer used to doing anything so common as holding a gateway. Bashir, a
tasty one.
much at ease with himself.
And this one's a hybrid.
His cloak was flung back despite the morning's coolness. Not so cold as the mountains, but still
I
windy.
got this
He
one.
nodded casually to Anayla and Ailil, who gave bleak stares in return. Bashir smiled through those thick mustaches.
This from the indica there. I got this one from
pleasant smile.
my
He had
aunt
as many doubts of the women as
for
the women knew
Christmas.
about Bashir's reservations, at least. Turning her head quickly from the Saldaean, Anayla returned to stroking her gelding's mane. Ailil, the reins too rigid.
Damn, I'm dropping everything.
That pair had not strayed far from Rand since the incident on the ridge, even having their tents pitched in earshot of his the night before.
And it
On
was
a brown
cool
grass
because
hillside opposite,
when she had me pick this.
Women's retainers,
These
the returned to watching Rand.
the anti-clogging.
Watched Ailil, and maybe Anayla as well.
No, it's cool because she had these, and it looked like a cigarette pack. But when you opened it, it was like 5 or 6 of these in a row. And she just opened it up and said, "Pick one." And I just grabbed it.
Was that if they did want him dead, he would give them no opportunity. Who knows a woman's heart? Who's there and chuckled?
Damn.
Sounded in one of his
No, I don't want to time that one out.
Most women will shrug off what a man would kill you for, and kill you for what a man would shrug off. Rand ignored him. The last gateway in Rand's sight went down. The Ashaman mounting their horses were too far for him to say for sure.
Yeah,
He still held on to Saidin.
my aunt tells me that too.
Clumsy to she,
But my aunt,
nearly fell off
my
the
mom
bike.
and my aunt both live together.
Most of the
And
bike
and
rode
the
in
funny thing about my mom and aunt,
the
they're
rest of the nobles gathered quickly
they're
to
twin
cheer on the
sisters.
slopes just below Rand. The highest ranking, and those with the most power in front, after a little jostling here and there, where precedence remained uncertain. Tahara and Marcolin kept their horses in the fringes on opposite sides of the mass of nobles.
Now time for my good
faces
drink.
carefully blank. They might be asked for advice, but both knew the final decisions rested with others. Wireman opened his mouth with a grand gesture, doubtless to begin another splendid peroration on the glories of following the Dragon Reborn. Sunaman and Torian, accustomed to his speeches and powerful enough to take no care around him, reined their horses together and began talking quietly. Sunaman's face wore an unaccustomed hardness, and Torian seemed ready to squabble over a boundary line, despite the red satin stripes on his coat sleeves. Square-jawed Bertone and some of the other Kyrianen were not quiet at all, laughing at each other's jokes. Everyone had had a bellyful of Wireman's grand declamations. Though Samaradrid's scowl deepened every time he looked at Ailil and Anayla, he did not like them remaining close to Rand, especially his countrywoman. So perhaps his sourness had more root than Wireman's windiness. "About 10 miles from us," Rand said loudly, "a good 50,000 men are preparing to march." They were aware of that, but it pulled every eye to him and silenced every tongue. Wireman's mouth snapped shut sourly. The fellow did love to hear himself talk. Graham and Marakan, tugging at sharp-oiled beards, smiled.
I guess.
Samaradrid looked like a man who had eaten an entire bowl of plums. Gregorin, the 3 lords of the 9 with him, very more grim determined.
How about you?
The The scouts saw no signs of Sultan or Damani, Rand went on. But even without them, even with Ashaman, it's enough to kill a lot of us if anybody forgets the plan. No one will forget, though, I'm sure. No charges without orders this time. He'd made that clear as glass and hard as stone. No herring off because you thought maybe you just might have seen something either. Wyverman smiled, managing to put as much oil into it as Cinnamon ever could. It was a simple plan in its way. They would advance west in 5 columns, each with Ashaman, and attempt to fall on the Shanchan from every side at once. Or as close to all sides as could be managed. Simple plans were best, Bashir insisted.
Not sure how I lost that.
If you won't be satisfied with a whole litter of fat piglets, he had muttered, if you have to rush into the woods to find the old sow, then don't get too fancy or she'll gut you.
Right. I'm glad on that too. Glad you're still here. Glad I'm still here. Glad my brother's still here. I guess those are good things.
His voice began to gain intensity and drift into wild, disbelieving
Hey,
laughter.
D-Man, how you doing, bro?
Can't be wrong, but it is. Something strange. Something wrong.
Oh, shit. Hell yeah.
Twitching. His cackles turned to weeping.
That's badass, bro.
I must be mad. And he vanished before Rand.
And I'm working right now on that skull with the Indian headdress.
Duck on a beetle. Luce Theron was mad, no doubt of it, but so long as Randall Thor remained sane. A bitter joke on the world.
Yeah, I'm definitely glad I'm alive and still out.
Take your places, he commanded with a wave of the dragon scepter. He had to fight down the urge to laugh at that joke.
But yeah, hell yeah, that's pretty good price for it.
Milling and muttering as they sorted themselves out. Few liked the way Rand had divided them up. Whatever breaking down of barriers had occurred in the shop.
That one I finished that had the skull with the pot leaves on it. I ended up donating that one to one of our local smoke shop or dispensaries that we always go to, because they're good people and they always try to help everyone out and do all kinds of stuff for the community. So I figured I got it because I got it sealed and I ended up getting a frame for it. So I ended up donating it to them. But the one I'm working on now is, let's see, let me pull it up for you real quick.
Those three had accepted.
I have it in there.
Simple reason that he was not
Well, it's on my light table.
Depending on the man.
I really don't want to move
Rochad
it.
seemed to be trying the same with Bashir that Gedwin was with Wyverman, but Bashir appeared to ignore it. A little way from Bashir's party, Torian and Marakan rode with their heads together, likely venting spleen at having Samaradrid placed over them. For that matter, Urshan Natari kept glancing toward Jordwin, and standing in his stirrups to look back toward Gregorin and Kirill, though it was improbable he could see them any longer past the hills. Samaradrid, his back iron rod straight, looked as unflappable as Bashir. It was the same principle Rand had used all along.
Brightness
He
down.
trusted Bashir, and he thought he
That
might be able
tends
to
to
trust
help.
Gregorin. None of the others could dare think of turning against him, with so many outlanders around him, so many old enemies.
But that's the one I'm working on right now.
Rand laughed softly, watching them all ride off from his hillside.
That one
They would fight for him.
is
fight
still
well,
pretty
because they
much.
had no other choice.
That one's still pretty much up for grabs for when I get done with it.
Madness, Luce Theron hissed. Rand shoved the voice away angrily.
But yeah, I'm working on
He was
this one.
hardly alone, of course. Tiara and Marcolin had most of the defenders and companions mounted in ranks.
I'm getting there. I'm
trees
just
on
kind of
the one where he sat his
just
horse.
taking my time on it right now.
The rest were out as a screen against surprise. The company of blue-coated legionmen waited patiently in the hollow below, under Mason's eye, and at their rear, as many men in what they had worn surrendering on the heath back in Ilion. They were trying to emulate the legionmen's calm, the other legionmen now, trying without a great deal of success. Rand glanced at Ailil and Aniala. The Tyran woman gave him a simpering smile, but it faltered weakly. The Karianan woman's face was frost.
That one has
Ford and Harrod and their armsmen. His column in the center would be the largest and the strongest by a fair margin.
I think like 16 or more. It has a good little amount of different colors in it, in different shades.
Rode up the hill toward him. The balding old man,
but I think 16 or more, if I remember right.
Now wore the dragon as well as the sword, and the Shiva had worn it first. In part, it was because the younger men deferred to Flynn with his long experience.
Yeah, but that's what I'm doing right now, man.
In part, it was because Dashiva did not seem to care.
And then I start on.
He only appeared amused by the others. When he could spare time for
these
talking
big
to himself, it was. Most often, he hardly seemed aware of anything past his own nose. For that reason, it was something of a shock when Dashiva awkwardly booted his slab-sided mount ahead of the rest. That plain face, so often vague or bemused with the fellow's own thoughts, was fixed in a worried frown. It was more than something of a shock when he seized Saidin as soon as he reached Rand and wove a barrier around them against eavesdropping. Lucerne did not waste breath, if a disembodied voice had breath, and mutters about killing. He lurched for the source, snarling wordlessly, tried to claw the power away from Rand, and just as abruptly fell silent and vanished. There's something askew with Saidin here, something amiss, Dashiva said, sounding not at all vague. In fact, he sounded precise and testy. A teacher lecturing a particularly dense pupil. He even stabbed a finger at Rand. I don't know what it is. Nothing can twist Saidin, and if it could be twisted, we'd have felt it back in the mountains. Well, there was something there yesterday, but so small. I feel it clearly. Saidin is eager. I know. Saidin is not alone.
I know tomorrow,
pulses.
See how I feel, because me and my brother got to go around and do a little bill paying tomorrow, but see how I feel after we get done with that.
Usually the man maintained a better hold on himself, though, however precarious.
Probably, well,
I've been channeling
either way, I'm gonna get down on it some more, but
he could not soften his tone.
It just depends on how much I'm gonna get down on.
Get to your place. We'll be moving soon. The scouts had to return soon. Even in this flatter country, even limited to no further than they could see, 10 miles would not take long to cover traveling. Dashiva made no move to obey. Instead, he opened his mouth angrily, then snapped it shut. Shaking visibly, he drew a deep breath. I am well aware how long you have channeled, he said in an icy, almost contemptuous voice. But surely even you can feel it. Feel, man! I don't like strange, applied to Saidin, and I don't want to die or be burned out because you're blind. Look at my ward. Look at it. Rand stared. Dashiva pushing himself forward was peculiar enough, but Dashiva in a temper? And then he did look at the ward. Really look. The flows should have been as steady as the threads in tight-woven canvas. They vibrated. The ward stood solid as it should be, but the individual threads of the power shimmered with faint movement. Moore had said Saidin was strange near Abu Dar, and for 100 miles around. They were closer than 100 miles now. Rand made himself feel Saidin. He was always aware of it. Anything else meant death. Yet he had become used to the struggle. He fought for life, but the fight had become as natural as life. The struggle was life. He made himself feel that battle, his life. Cold to make stone shatter into dust, fire to make stone flash to vapor, filth to make a rotten cesspit smell a garden in full flower, and a pulsing, like something quivering in his fist. This was not the sort of throbbing he had felt in Shadar Logoth, when the taint of Saidin had resonated with the evil of that place, and Saidin had pulsed with it. The vileness was strong but steady here. It was Saidin itself that seemed full of currents and surges. Eager, Dashiva called it, and Rand could see why. Down the slope, behind Flynn, Moore scrubbed a hand through his hair and looked around uneasily. Flynn alternated shifting on his saddle and easing his sword in its scabbard. Narishma, watching the sky for flying creatures, blinked. A muscle twitched in Hadley's cheek. Every one of them displayed some sign of nervousness, and little wonder. Relief welled up in Rand. Not madness after all. The Shiva smiled, a twisted, self-satisfied smile. I cannot believe you didn't notice before. There was very close to a sneer in his voice. You've been holding Sidene practically day and night since we began this mad expedition. This is a simple ward, but it did not want to form. Then it snapped together like pulling out of my hands. The silver-blue slash of a gateway rotated open atop one of the bare hills, half a mile to the west, and a soldier pulled his horse through and mounted hurriedly, returning from the scout. Even at a distance, Rand could make out the faint shimmer of the weaves surrounding the gateway before they vanished. The rider had not reached the bottom of the hill before another gateway opened on the crest, and then a third, a fourth. More, one after another, almost as fast as the preceding man could get out of the way. But it did form, Rand said. So at the scouts' gateways. If Sidene is hard to control, it's always hard. And it still does what you want. But why more difficult here? A question for another time. Light, he wished Herodfell were still alive. The old philosopher might have had an answer. Get back with the others, Tashiva, he ordered. But the man stared at him in astonishment, and he had to repeat himself before the fellow let the ward vanish, jerked his horse around without a salute, and thumped the animal back down the slope with his heels. Some trouble, my Lord Dragon? Anila simpered. Ailil merely looked at Rand with flat eyes. Seeing the first scout on the way toward Rand, the others fanned off to north and south, where they would join one of the other columns. Finding them the old-fashioned way would be faster than casting about with gateways. Drawing rein in front of Rand, Nalam slapped fist to chest. Did he look a bit wild-eyed? No matter. Sidene still did what the man wielding it made it do. Nalam saluted and gave his report. The Shanchan were not encamped 10 miles away. They were no more than 5 or 6 distant, marching east. And they had Suldam and Damani by the score. Rand issued his orders as Nalam galloped away, and his column began moving west. The defenders and the companions rode on either flank. The Legion men marched at the rear, just behind Enharid. A reminder to the noblewomen and their armsmen if they needed one. Anila certainly looked over her shoulder often enough, and Ailil's refusal to was pointed. Rand formed the main thrust of the column, Rand and Flynn and the others, just as it would be with the other columns. Ashaman to strike, and men with steel to guard their backs while they killed. The sun still had a long way to climb before midday. Nothing had changed to alter the plan. Madness waits for some, Luce Theron whispered. It creeps up on others. Mirage rode near the head of his army, marching east along a muddy road that wound through hilly olive groves and patchy forest. Not at the head. A full regiment, most Shanchan, rode between him and the forward scouts. He had known generals who wanted to be at the very front. Most were dead. Most had lost the battles they died in. Mud kept down dust, yet word of an army on the move ran like wildfire on the Salas plains, whatever the land. Here and there among the olive trees, he spotted an overturned wheelbarrow or an abandoned pruning hook, but the workers had vanished long since. Luckily, they would avoid his opponents as much as they did.
Right back.
With luck, lacking rocking, his opponents would not know he was on them until it was too late. Mirage did not like trusting to luck. Aside from under-officers ready to produce maps or copy orders, and messengers ready to carry them, he rode accompanied only by Avildar Yulan, small enough to make his quite ordinary brown gelding seem immense, a fiery man with the nails of his little fingers painted green, who wore a black wig to conceal his baldness, and Lassane Jarath, a gray-haired woman from Shandar itself, whose pale plump face and blue eyes were a study in serenity. Yulan was not calm. This cold, dark captain of the air often wore a scowl for the rules that seldom let him touch the reins of a
Okay, I'm back.
But
Yeah, scratching D-man, that one.
the sky was clear.
It has
Perfect weather for rocking.
21 different colors.
None of his
I just went and counted them.
Not here. There were too few rockets with the Hylene's
21 colors on that one.
Lassane's calm troubled Mirage more. More than the senior Der Sudam on
I'm definitely looking forward to
with whom he had shared many a cup of
seeing what it looks like when it's done.
An animated woman, always bubbling over with enthusiasms and amusement. And she was icy calm, as silent as any Suldam he had tried to question. Within his sight were 20 Damani flanking the horsemen, each walking beside her Suldam's mount. The Suldam bobbed in their saddles, bending to pat a Damani's head, straightening only to bend again to stroke her hair. The Damani looked steady enough to his eye, but plainly the Suldam were on razor's edge. And ebullient Lassane rode silent as a stone. A Torm appeared ahead, racing down the column. Well off to the side, on the edge of the groves, yet horses whickered and shied as the bronze-scaled creature flowed past. A trained Torm would not attack horses, at least not unless the killing frenzy overtook it. The reason Torm were no good in battle, but horses trained to become around Torm were in as short supply as Torm themselves. Mirage sent a skinny underlieutenant named Varek to fetch the Morat Torm's scouting report. Afoot, and the light consumed whether Varek lost sight there. He would not waste time on Varek trying to control a mount acquired locally. The man returned faster than he went, and made a crisp bow, beginning his report before his back was straight again. The enemy is less than 5 miles to east, my Lord Captain General, marching in our direction. They are deployed in 5 columns, spaced approximately 1 mile apart. So much for luck. But Mirage had considered how he would attack 40,000 with only 5 himself, and 50 Damani. Quickly, men were galloping with others to deploy to meet an attempted envelopment, and the regiments behind him began turning into the groves, Suldam riding among them with their Damani. Gathering his cloak against a sudden cold wind, Mirage noticed something that made him feel colder still. Lassane was watching the Suldam vanish into the trees too, and she had begun to sweat. Bertom rode easily, letting the wind stream his cloak to one side, but he studied the forested country ahead with a wariness he barely attempted to conceal. Of his 4 countrymen at his back, only Deresin was truly skilled in the game of houses. That fool tyrant dog Wireman was blind, of course. Bertom glared at the puffed-up buffoon's back. Wireman rode well ahead of the rest in deep conversation with Gedwin, and if Bertom needed any further proof that the tyrant would smile at what gagged a goat, it was how he towerated that hot-eyed young monster. He noticed Kirill glancing sideways at him and reined his gray further from the towering man. He had no particular enmity toward the Ilianer, but he did hate people looming over him. He could not wait to return to Cairhien, where he did not have to be surrounded by ungainly giants. Kirill Drapaneus was not blind, though, however overtall. He had sent a dozen scouts forward, too. Wireman had sent 1. Doris, Bertom said softly. Then a little louder. Doresin, you lump! The bony man gave a start in his saddle. Like Bertom, like the other 3, he had shaved and powdered the front of his head. The style of marking yourself like a soldier had become quite fashionable. Doresin should have called him a toad in return, the way they had since boyhood, but instead he heeled his gelding up beside Bertom's and leaned close. He was worried and letting it show, his forehead furrowed deeply. You realize the Lord Dragon means us to die, he whispered, glancing at the column trailing behind them. Blood and fire, I only listened to Colivert, but I have known I was a dead man since he killed her. For a moment, Bertom eyed the column of armsmen, snaking back through the rolling hills. The trees were more scattered here than ahead, but still enough to shield an attack until it was right on top of you. The last olive grove nearly a mile behind. Wireman's men rode at the fore, of course, in those ridiculous coats with their fat white-striped sleeves, and then Kirill's Ilianers in enough green and red to shame tinkers. His own people, decently clad in dark blue beneath their breastplates, were still beyond his sight, with Doresins and the others, ahead only of the company of legionmen. Wireman had seemed surprised that the foot kept up, though he had hardly set a difficult pace. It was not really the armsmen Bertram glanced at, though. 7 men rode before even Wireman's, 7 men with hard faces and death-cold eyes in black coats. One wore a pin in the shape of a silver sword on his tall collar. An elaborate way to go about it, he told Doresson dryly, and I doubt Althor would have sent those fellows with us if we were just being fed into a sausage grinder. Forehead still creased, Doresson opened his mouth again, but Bertram said, I need to talk to the tyrant. He disliked seeing his childhood friend this way. Althor had unhinged him. Absorbed in one another, Wireman and Gedwin did not hear him riding up on them. Gedwin was idly playing with his reins, his features cold with contempt. The tyrant was red-faced. I don't care who you are, he was saying to the black-coated man in a low, hard voice, spittle flying. I won't take more risk without a command direct from the lips of... Abruptly, the pair became aware of Bertram. Wireman's mouth snapped shut. He glared as if he wanted to kill Bertram. The Ashaman's ever-present smile melted away. The wind gusted cold and sharp as clouds drifted across the sun, but no colder than Gedwin's sudden stare. With a small shock, Bertram realized the man also wanted to strike him dead on the spot. Gedwin's icily murderous gaze did not change, but Wireman's face underwent a remarkable transformation. The red faded slowly as he produced a smile in an instant, an oily smile with only a trace of mocking condescension. I've been thinking about you, Bertram, he said heartily. A pity Althor strangled your cousin. With his own hands, I hear. Frankly, I was surprised you came when he called. I've seen him watching you. I fear he plans something more interesting for you than thrashing your heels on the floor while his fingers tighten on your throat. Bertram suppressed a sigh, and not only at the fool's clumsiness. To manipulate him with Colabert's death. She had been his favorite cousin, but ambitious beyond reason. Saigon had good claims to the Sun Throne, yet she could not have held it against the strength of Ryoton or Damodred, either one, let alone both together, not without the open blessings of the White Tower or the Dragon Reborn. Still, she had been his favorite. What did Wireman want? Certainly not what it seemed on the surface. Even this tyrant oaf was not that simple. Before he could frame any response, a horseman came galloping toward them through the trees ahead. A Kyrian. And as he reined to a sudden halt in front of them, that made his horse sit back on its haunches, Bertram recognized one of his own armsmen, a gap-toothed fellow with seamed scars on both cheeks. Doyle, he thought, from the Colchain estates. My Lord Bertram, the fellow panted, bowing hastily. There are 2,000 Terrabonners hard on my heels, and women with them, with lightning on their dresses. Hard on his heels, Wireman murmured disparagingly. We'll see what my man has to say when he gets back. I certainly don't see any... Sudden whoops in the near distance ahead cut him off, and the thunder of hooves, and then quickly galloping lancers appeared, a flowing tide spreading through the trees, straight toward Bertram and the others. Wireman laughed. Kill whoever you wish, whenever you wish, Gedwin, he said, drawing sword with a flourish. I use the methods I use, and that's that. Racing back toward his armsman, he waved the blade over his head, shouting, Santiago! Santiago and glory! It was no surprise he did not add a shout for his country to those for his house and his greatest love. Spurring in the same direction, Bertram raised his own voice. Saigon and Kyrian! No need for sword-waving yet. Saigon and Kyrian! What had the man been after? Thunder rumbled, and Bertram looked to the sky, perplexed. There were a few more clouds than earlier. No. Doyle, Dolly, had mentioned those women. And then he forgot all about whatever the fool tyrant wanted, as steel-veiled Terrabonners poured over the wooded hills toward him, the earth blooming fire and the sky raining lightning ahead of them. Saigon and Kyrian! He shouted. The wind rose. Horsemen clashed amid thick trees and heavy underbrush, where shadows hung heavily. The light seemed to be failing, the clouds thickening overhead, but it was hard to say with the dense forest canopy for a roof. Booming roars half drowned the ring of steel on steel, the shouts of men, the screams of horses. Sometimes the ground shook. Sometimes the enemy raised shouts. Den Lucianos! Den Lucianos and the bees! Annalyn! Rally to Annalyn! Hailin! Hailin! For the High Lord Sunaman! The last was the only cry Varric understood in the least, though he suspected any of the locals who named themselves High Lords or Ladies might not be offered the chance to swear the oath. He jerked his sword free from where he had jammed it into his opponent's armpit, just above the breastplate, and let the pale little man topple. A dangerous fighter until he made the mistake of raising his blade too high. The man's bay crashed off through the undergrowth, and Varric spared a moment for regret. The animal looked better than the white-footed dun he was forced to ride. A moment only, and then he was peering through the close-set trees, where it seemed vines dangled from half the branches and bunches of some gray, feathery plant from nearly all. Sounds of battle rose from every direction, but at first he could see nothing that moved. Then a dozen Altaran lances appeared at 50 paces, walking their horses and peering about carefully, though the way they talked loudly among themselves more than justified the red slashes crisscrossing their breastplates. Varric gathered his reins, meaning to take them in. An escort, even this undisciplined rabble, might be the difference between the urgent message he carried reaching Banner General Chiang Mai and not. Black streaks flashed from among the trees, emptying Altaran saddles. Their horses dashed in every direction as the riders fell, and then there were only a dozen corpses sprawled on the damp carpet of dead leaves, at least one crossbow bolt jutting from every man. Nothing moved. Varric shivered in spite of himself. Those foot in blue coats had seemed easy at first, with no pikes to stand behind, but they never came into the open, hiding behind trees, in dips in the ground. They were not the worst. He had been sure after the frantic retreat to the ships at Falma that he had seen the worst he ever could see, the ever-victorious army in a rout. Not half an hour gone, though, he had seen 100 Taraboners face one lone man in a black coat. 100 lancers against one. The Taraboners had been ripped to shreds. Literally ripped to shreds. Men and horses simply exploding as fast as he could count. The slaughter had continued after the Taraboners turned to flee, went on so long as one of them remained in sight. Perhaps it was really no worse than having the ground erupt beneath your feet, but at least Damani usually left enough of you to be buried. He had been told by the last man he managed to speak to in these woods, a grizzled veteran from home leading 100 Amadisian pikes, that Chiang Mai was in this direction. Ahead, he spotted riderless horses tied to trees and men afoot. Maybe they could give him further direction, and he would give them the lash of his tongue for standing about while a battle raged. When he rode in among them, he forgot tongue lashings. He had found what he was looking for, but not at all what he wanted to find. A dozen badly burned corpses lay in a row. One, his honey-brown face untouched, was recognizably Chiang Mai. The men on their feet were all Taraboners, Amadisians, Altarans. Some of them were injured too. The only Shonchan was a tight-faced Suldam, soothing a weeping Damani. "What happened here?" Varric demanded. He did not think it was like these Ashaman to leave survivors. Maybe the Suldam had fought him off. "Madness, my lord." A hulking Taraboner shrugged away the man who was spreading ointment down his seared left arm. The sleeve appeared to have been burned away clear to the fellow's breastplate, yet despite his burns, he did not grimace. His veil of steel mail hung by a corner from his red-plumed conical helmet, bearing a hard face, with thick gray mustaches that nearly hid his mouth, and his eyes were insultingly direct. "A group of Ilianers. They fell on us without warning. At first, all went well. They had none of the blackcoats with them. Lord Chiang Mai, he led us bravely. And the woman channeled lightnings. Then, just as the Ilianers broke the lightnings, they fell among us, too." He cut off with a significant look at the Suldam. She was on her feet in an instant, shaking her free fist and striding as far toward the Taraboner as the leash attached to her other wrist would allow. Her Damani lay in a weeping heap. "I will not hear this dog's words against my Zakai. She is a good Damani, a good Damani." Varric made soothing gestures to the woman. He had seen Suldam make their charges howl for misdeeds, and a few who crippled the recalcitrant. but most would bristle even at one of the blood who cast aspersions on a favorite. This Tarabana was not of the blood, and by the look of the quivering Suldam, she was ready to do murder. Had the man voiced his ridiculous, unspoken charge, Barak thought she might have killed him on the spot. Prayers for the dead must wait, Barak said bluntly. What he was about to do would end with him in the hands of the Seekers if he failed, but there was not a Shonchen left standing here except the Suldam. I am assuming command. We will disengage and turn south. Disengage, the heavy-shouldered Tarabana barked. It will take us days to disengage. The Ilianers, they fight like badgers backed into a corner. The Karienen like ferrets in a box. The Tyrants, they're not so hard as I have heard, but there are maybe a dozen of these Ashaman, yes? I do not even know where 3/4 of my men are in this jolly bag. Emboldened by his example, the others began giving protest too. Barak ignored them, and forbore asking what a jolly bag was. Looking at the tangled forest all around him, listening to the clash of battle, the booms of explosions and lightnings, he could imagine. You will gather your men and begin pulling back, he said loudly, cutting through their chatter. Not too fast. You will act in unison. Mirage's orders to Chiang Mai said with all possible speed. He had memorized them in case something happened to the copy in his saddlebags. All possible speed, but too much speed in this, and half the men would be left behind, chopped to flinders at the enemy's leisure. Now move! You'll fight for the Empress. May she live forever. That last was the sort of thing you told fresh recruits, but for some reason the listening men jerked as if he had struck them all with his quirt. Bowing quickly and deeply, hands on knees, they all but flew to their horses. Strange. Now it was up to him to find the Shonchen units. One of those would be commanded by someone above him, and he could pass his responsibility. The Suldam was on her knees, stroking her still weeping Damani's hair and crooning softly. Get her soothed down, he told her, with all possible speed. And he thought he had seen a touch of anxiety in Mirage's eyes. What could make Kana Mirage anxious? I think we will be depending on you, Suldam, to the south. Now, why would that make the blood drain from her face? Bashir stood just inside the edge of the trees, frowning through his helmet's face bars at what he saw. His bay nuzzled his shoulder. He held his cloak close against the wind, more to avoid any motion that would draw eyes than for the cold, though that chilled his flesh. It would have been a spring breeze back in Saldaia, but months in the Southlands had softened him. Shining bright between gray clouds that sailed along quickly, the sun still lay a little short of midday, and ahead of him. Just because you began a battle facing west did not mean you ended it that way. Before him lay a broad pasture where flocks of black and white goats cropped at the brown grass in desultory fashion, just as if there was no battle raging all around them. Not that there was any sign of it here, for the moment. A man could get himself cut to doll rags crossing that meadow. And in the trees, whether forest or olive groves or thickets, you did not always see the enemy before you were on top of him, scouts or no scouts. If we're going to cross, Quaya muttered, rubbing a wide hand over his bald head, we should cross. Life's truth, we're wasting time. Amandred snapped his mouth shut. Likely the moon-faced Karienen had been about to say much the same thing. He would agree with a Tyran when horses climbed trees. Jordwin Samaras snorted. The man should have grown a beard to hide that narrow jaw. It made his head look like a forester's splitting wedge. I do say go around, he muttered. I've lost enough men to those light-cursed Damani, and... He trailed off with an uneasy glance toward Rochide. The young Ashaman stood by himself, mouth tight, fingering that dragon pin on his collar. Maybe wondering whether it was worth it, by the look of him. There was no knowing air about the boy now, only frowning worry. Leading quick by the reins, Bashir strode to the Ashaman and drew him farther aside in the trees. Pushed him farther aside. Rochide scowled, going reluctantly. The man was tall enough to loom over Bashir, but Bashir was having none of it. Can I count on your people next time? Bashir demanded, jerking a mustache in irritation. No delays. Rothschild and his fellows seemed to have grown slower and slower, responding when they found themselves opposite Damani. I know what I'm about, Bashir, Rothschild snarled. Aren't we killing enough of them for you? As far as I can see, we're about done. Bashir nodded slowly, not in agreement with the last. There were plenty of enemy soldiers left, almost anywhere you looked hard enough. But a good many were dead. He had patterned his movements on what he had studied of the Trolloc Wars, when the forces of the light seldom came anywhere near the numbers they had to face. Slash at the flanks and run. Slash at the rear and run. Slash and run. And when the enemy chased after, turn on the ground you had chosen beforehand, where the legionmen lay waiting with their crossbows, turn and cut at him until it was time to run again, or until he broke. Already today he had broken Tarabanners, Amadisians, Altarans, and these Shonchan in their strange armor. He had seen more enemy dead than in any fight since the Blood Snow. But if he had Ashaman, the other side had those Damani. A good third of his Saldanians lay dead along the miles behind. Nearly half his force was dead, all told. And there were still more Shonchan out there, with their cursed women, and Tarabanners, and Amadisians, and Altarans. They just kept coming, more appearing as soon as he finished the last. And the Ashaman were growing hesitant. Swinging into Quick's saddle, he rode back to Jordwin and the others. We go around, he ordered, ignoring Jordwin's nods as much as he did Guayam and Mondred's scowls. Triple scouts ahead. I mean to push hard, but I don't want to trip over a Damani. No one laughed. Rothschild had gathered the other 5 Ashaman around him, one with the silver sword pinned to his collar, the others without. There had been 2 more with bare collars when they started out that morning, but if Ashaman knew how to kill, so did Damani. Waving his arms angrily, Rothschild appeared to be arguing with them. His face was red, theirs blank and stubborn. Bashir just hoped Rothschild could keep all of them from deserting. Today had been costly enough without adding that sort of man wandering about loose. A light rain fell. Rand scowled at the thick black clouds gathering the sky, already beginning to obscure a pale sun halfway down to the far horizon. Light rain now, but it would thicken like those clouds. Irritably, he returned to studying the land ahead of him. The crown of swords pricked his temples. With the power in him, the land was clear as a map despite the weather. Clear enough, anyway. Hills sinking away, some covered with thickets or olive trees, others bare grass or just stone and weeds. He thought he saw movement at the edge of a copse, then again among the rows of an olive orchard on another hill a mile from the copse. Thinking was not enough. Dead men lay across the miles behind. Dead enemies. Dead women, too, he knew. But he had stayed away from anywhere Suldam and Damani had died, refused to see their faces. Most thought it was hatred for those who killed so many of his friends. Tideshah frisked a few steps on the hilltop before Rand settled him with a firm hand and the pressure of his knees. A fine thing if a Suldam spotted his movement. The few trees around him were not enough to hide much. Vaguely he realized he did not recognize a one of them. Tideshah tossed his head. Rand tucked the dragon scepter into his saddlebags, just the carved butt end sticking out, to free both hands in case the gelding was not satisfied. He could have taken weariness from the horse with Sayadin, but he knew no way to make it obey with the power. He could not see how the gelding retained enough energy. Sayadin filled him, bubbled in him, but his distantly felt body wanted to sag with weariness. Part of that was the sheer amount of the power he had handled today. Part was the strain of fighting Sayadin to make it do what he wanted. Always Sayadin had to be conquered, forced, but never before like today. The half-healed, never-healing wounds in his left side were agony. The older, an auger trying to drill through the void. The newer, a blaze of raw flame. It was an accident, my Lord Dragon, Adley said suddenly. I swear it was. Shut up and watch, Rand told him harshly. Adley's eyes sank to his hands on his own reins for a moment. Then he raked damp hair out of his face and jerked his head up obediently. day, here, controlling Saidin was harder than ever, but letting it slip anytime, anywhere could kill you. Adley had let it slip, and men had died in uncontrolled bursts of fire. Not just the Amadisians he had been aiming at, but near 30 of Ailil's armsmen, and almost as many of Anila's. Except for his slip, Adley would have been with more, with the companions in the woods half a mile to the south. Narishma and Hopwell were with the defenders to the north. Rand wanted Adley under his eye. Had any other accidents happened out of his sight? He could not watch everyone all the time. Flynn's face was grim as day-old death, and Shiva, far from looking vague, seemed on the point of sweating with concentration. He still muttered to himself under his breath, so low Rand could not hear even with the power in him. But the man mopped rain from his face continually with a sodden lace-edged linen handkerchief that had grown more than grimy as the day wore on. Rand did not think they had slipped. In any case, neither they nor Adley held the power now, nor would until he instructed them to seize it. "Is it done?" Anila asked behind him. Heedless of who might be watching out there, Rand wheeled Tie-Dye Shah around to face her. The Tyran woman started back in her saddle, the hood of her richly elaborate rain cape falling to her shoulders. Her cheek gave a twitch. Her eyes might have been full of fear or hate. At her side, Ailil fingered her reins calmly with red-gloved hands. "What more can you want?" the smaller woman asked in a cool voice. A lady being polite to a menial. Barely. "If the size of a victory is accounted by dead enemies, I think today alone will put your name in the histories." "I mean to drive the Shan into the sea," Rand snapped. Right, he had to finish them now, when he had the chance. He could not fight the Shan and the Forsaken, and the Light alone knew who or what else, all at the same time. "I did it before, and I will again." "Do you have the Horn of Alir hidden in your pocket this time?" Luz Theron asked slyly. Rand snarled at him silently. "There's someone below," Flynn said suddenly. "Riding up this way. From the west." Rand pulled his mount back around. Legionmen ringed the slopes of the hill, though they hid well enough that he seldom caught sight of a blue coat. None of them had a horse. Who would be riding? Bashir's bay trotted up the slope, almost as though it were level ground. Bashir's helmet hung from his saddle, and the man himself looked tired. Without preamble, he spoke in a flat voice. "We're finished here. Part of fighting is knowing when to go, and it's time. I've left 500 dead behind, near enough, and 2 of your soldiers for salt. I sent 3 more to find Samaradrid, Gregorin, and Wyraman and tell them to rally on you. I doubt they're in any better condition than I am. How does your butcher's bill run?" Rand ignored the question. His own dead topped Bashir's by close to 200. "You had no right sending orders to the others. So long as there are half a dozen Ashaman left, so long as there's me, I have enough. I mean to find the rest of the Shan army and destroy it, Bashir. I won't let them add Altara to Terabon and Amadisia." Bashir knuckled his thick mustaches with a wry laugh. "You want to find them? Look out there." He swept a gauntleted hand across the hills to the west. "I can't point to a particular spot, but there are 10, maybe 15,000 close enough to see from here, if those trees weren't in the way. I danced with the Dark One getting through them unseen to reach you. Maybe 100 Damani down there, maybe more. More coming for sure, and more men. Seems their general has decided to concentrate on you. I suppose it isn't always cheese and ale being Tamiran." "If they're out there..." Rand scanned the hills. The rain fell more heavily. Where had he seen movement? Lighty was tired. Saidin hammered at him. Unconsciously, he touched the wrapped bundle beneath his stirrup leather. His hand jerked away of its own accord. 10,000, even 15. Once Samaradrid reached him, and Gregorin and Wyraman. More important, once the rest of the Ashaman did. "If they're out there, that's where I'll destroy them, Bashir. I'll hit them from all sides, the way we intended in the first place." Frowning, Bashir reined his horse closer and until his knee almost touched Rand's. Flynn moved his mount away, but Hadley was too focused on staring through the rain to notice anything so near, and Toshiba, still wiping his face incessantly, stared with open interest. Bashir lowered his voice to him.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for right now. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone that keeps stopping by and sharing with me. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.
This might answer your question. Cannabis, also known as marijuana or weed among other names,